Yujin, in trying to understand the God to which the Judeo-Christian Islamic religions point, one looks at what is the creation? What did that God make? And in the classic scriptures, God made the earth, and the heavens is defined as kind of the star shell around earth, and maybe human beings and animals. And as science has learned more and more, we see vastly bigger creations, and now we're into multiple universes. So the claim of science is that the traditional God is so far outclassed by the vastness of reality that the traditional God we might as well toss away. So when I step back, if I want to believe in God, I have to ask, how large is God's creation? How do we begin to address that?
So one possibility is that God created many universes. So recently, many scientists claim that there are infinitely many universes, and they are all as real as our universe. That's one possibility. And it might even be the case that God is identical to the totality of all possible universes. Maybe God, as the greatest possible being, is the totality of all possible universes.
Well, if God is that, then God didn't create that.
In the classical sense, yes, God didn't create these universes individually. But at the same time, you could think like this. So if God exists necessarily, and if God is identical to the totality of all universes, then the totality of all universes is self-existent. And sometimes self-existence is understood as something that doesn't depend on any external causes.
Okay.
And in that case, we can say that in one sense, God self-created the series of universes, infinitely many universes.
So this relies on several factors. It relies on defining God as necessary, which technically means no matter what state of affairs you can imagine in any sort of world in any way, God would have to be there, this concept. And then there exists all these multiple worlds. And then the third step is that God is the equivalent of those worlds.
That's right.
You have to go through several kind of complicated steps to get there.
That's right. But I derived this idea from the traditional definition of God, which is very common among theists. So they claim that God is the greatest possible being. And one understanding of this concept is that the greatest possible being is the totality of absolutely everything, including all possible worlds and possible beings.
So if that's true, God didn't create it, but it potentially could be self-existing, because that's how you're defining God, as a necessary being.
That's right.
It certainly doesn't sound like any sort of personal God that would have any interest in me, maybe an interest in you, but not me.
Yeah, so this God is not a personal God. But interestingly enough, this position offers answers to many problems in the philosophy of religion. So we can explain away the problem of evil, the problem of fine-tuning, and why there is something rather than nothing.
Oh, so how do you do each of those?
Okay, so let's consider the problem of evil first. So the problem of evil says, why is there evil in this world? If you think that there are infinitely many universes, then it's not surprising that there is evil, because some possible universes definitely contain evil. And it happens to be the case that our universe contains evil, just like many other universes.
So, okay, and fine-tuning, I guess, because you have so many universes, some of them are going to have the characteristics that we can emerge. That's an easy one.
That's right, yeah.
And something rather than nothing, that's a hard one, because you have to postulate that there's a reason for these universes, unless you're self-defining it as necessary, and that's cheating.
I'm not cheating here, because God is by definition the greatest possible being, and the greatest possible being is self-existent. So if God is the totality of all possible worlds, and if it's self-existent, then it exists necessarily. So it's necessarily the case that there are infinitely many universes.
Certainly this contradicts strongly the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, view that God is an independent entity that created the world and God and the world are separate. I mean, that's number one. Number two is there's no personal God in this. So in these two fundamental categories, this view would deny the traditional Western theology.
That is right. So if you think that God has to be a personal being, then you cannot accept this view, because this view entails that God is just a totality of all possible worlds. It's not a personal being who would create things.
Yeah, but why even call it God then? Why don't just call it the multi-universe of the scientists or the all possible worlds of some philosophers? Why do you need God? Why do you call it with something that other people use to make them feel good, to trick them into believing this?
I call it God because it's derived from the definition of God, which is very common among philosophers of religion, especially theistic philosophers, which is, again, the greatest possible being.
So by defining God as the greatest possible being, then you go out and try to find what represents that definition.
That's right. And in one sense, this being, the totality of all possible worlds, had some of God's properties as well. So in one sense, this totality is omniscient because it subsumes all possible pieces of knowledge, and it subsumes all possible powers and all possible instances of benevolence and so on. So in one sense, we could say that this being is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent as well. But at the same time, this being contains a lot of awful things as well, because here we are saying that the totality of all possible worlds includes all possible states of affairs.